All right, so this is really one of my absolute favorite parts of this unit that we're getting into, mainly because it has to do with logic. And logic, a lot of times, is applicable in so many aspects of the real world. You know, just arguing in general, you have to know how to be able to, conduct yourself and how to make an argument for something. So, what we're going to do is start with identifying the hypothesis and conclusion of a given statement. We'll write conditional statements, we'll write converse, inverse, and contrapositive statements, and then we're going to write some biconditional statements. So it's pretty general, pretty easy, but there is a lot of vocab, so let's go ahead and get going so you can get all of it written down. All right, so here's all our vocab words that we need for this lesson. So we're going to start with hypothesis. So hypothesis means it's the phrase that immediately follows the word if. So you'll have a statement that starts with if, it follows it. The symbolic representation is the letter P. The letter P is pretty arbitrary. There's no reason for it. It's just what's commonly used. Then we have what's called the conclusion. And the conclusion would be the phrase that immediately follows the word then. And that symbol that we use to represent the conclusion is Q. Then what we have is our conditional statement. And so the conditional is taking your hypothesis and your conclusion and writing them in a statement together. And so you write it in if-then form, and you use this little arrow, and I want you to write down that that arrow right there, this means implies. So that's how you would read it. P implies Q. All right, now as we move on down, converse is taking your hypothesis and conclusion and switching spots. So you're starting with your conditional statement. We're going to take the Q and put it where the P was, and take the P and put it where the Q was. Then we move into our inverse. And so this one, again, we're basing it on our conditional. And so what we do is negate. Remember that that symbol right there means not. So if you need to remind yourself from the last lesson, this means not. Okay, so not P implies not Q. These, one more before I tell you that. The contrapositive. So what we're going to do is actually both the converse and the inverse. So we're going to swap them, so Q and P switch places, and we're going to negate them both. So not Q implies not P. And these three things right here, the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive, these are all called related conditionals. And the whole reason behind that is just because every single one of them is based on the conditional statement. You can't get the converse if you don't have the conditional or even inverse. And so those are called related conditional statements. And then we have what's last, which is called our biconditional statement. And so the conjunction of a conditional and its inverse. So it's taking these, or I'm not inverse, I'm sorry, converse. So it's taking these two statements, conditional and converse, and it's putting this little symbol in between. And that symbol right there, the way that you read that is the words if and only if. Okay, so that is how you would read that. So P, if and only if, Q. Okay, so now let's take these symbols and actually put some meaning to them so that you can see how this all works. So what we're going to do then is we're going to look at these statements right here. So if you are an NBA basketball player, then you are at least 5 feet 2 inches tall, which I would hope because that's really tiny. 5 feet 2 as an NBA basketball player, that's really small. But, I digress. Okay, so the word if, you'll see it right here, and then you see you are an NBA basketball player right there. That is your hypothesis. So there is your hypothesis. Or you could represent it by using the letter P. Then we have the word then, and we've got you are at least 5 feet 2 inches tall. Well, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. And that part right there would be your conclusion. Okay, and then that would be your Q statement. All right, now in your second example here, a person is an adult when he or she is at least 18 years old. Well, what we don't have is the word if, and we don't have the word then. So what we're going to do is take that statement and actually write it in that form first, and then we can identify what our hypothesis and conclusion is. So the key thing is we want to keep these words generally in the same order that they're already in. We don't want to like switch them around or change any meanings. So we would say, let's say a person is an adult when he or she is at least 18 years old. So if a person is an adult, then he or she is at least 18 years old. All right, so I put it in if-then form. And now I'm going to go ahead and use the same colors as the previous example. For the hypothesis, here's our if. So our hypothesis is a person is an adult. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the yellow again for the conclusion. Here's our then, and so the conclusion would be he or she is at least 18 years old. Okay, and so your hypothesis right there, and conclusion would be right here. Okay, and notice how I put it in if then, so you always want to do that, it's really important. Okay, so now we're going to write conditional and related conditional statements. So remember, related means they're based on that conditional statement. So the conditional would mean we just need to take this example of all squares are quadrilaterals and we need to put it into if-then form. So how would we do that? Because we can't say if all squares, then quadrilaterals, right? Like that doesn't quite make any sense. So what we do is kind of add a couple of words just to make sure that we have our verbiage correct. So we would say, if a shape, is a square, then it is a quadrilateral. So now we have it in if-then form, and I'll keep consistent with the colors. If a shape is a square, there's your hypothesis. Then it is a quadrilateral. There we go, and there is your conclusion. And so now when I come back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to label this as P, and I'm going to go ahead and label this part over here as Q. So when we go to write our converse, our next statement, I want you to remember just really quickly, converse means you switch Q and you switch P. So what we would do then is we're not going to switch it and say if it is a quadrilateral because it's kind of weird wording. So what we'll do is say if a shape is a quadrilateral. So notice we're keeping the whole idea of the quadrilateral as our Q. All right, so that's coming up front. Oopsie, now I got myself all messed up. My bad. Okay, if a shape is a quadrilateral, then it is a square. And you'll notice that the whole idea of it being a quadrilateral is right here. So Q now comes first, and then for our second part, it being a square, P comes second. All right, now jump into your inverse. So for your inverse statement, what you're doing is you're negating them both. And so to negate them means that you're adding the word not, okay? So what we're gonna do then is say if a shape is not a square, so remember we're coming back all the way to our conditional and all we're doing is saying not. We're saying the opposite meaning. So if a shape is not a square, then it is not a quadrilateral. Okay, so we have our P statement, but we negated it by adding that word not in front, and then we have our Q statement, but we negated it by putting the not in front of that as well. All right, and then for our last example of these 4 different types of statements is our contrapositive. So let me just slide this over one more time. So the contrapositive is negating and switching. So we switch spots for both, and then we put our not in there. So it's kind of like taking your inverse and then just changing up the order. So what we'll say then is if a shape is not a quadrilateral, then it is not a square. And there we go. And so now you'll notice that the quadrilateral, remember that corresponds to Q, and we put not in front, so that's not Q, implies not P. Square was P. And that's all there is to it. And it just kind of has a whole pattern to it. And if you keep doing conditional, converse, inverse, contrapositive, conditional, converse, inverse, contrapositive, if you keep going in that order, you'll memorize what way these have to be configured in order to comprise these different statements. All right, now this is our last example that we have for the video, and we're writing biconditional statements. And so it's important to know that in order to get a biconditional, you have to have a conditional and you have to have its converse. So for the conditional statement, remember we need to take our original and we have to put it into if-then form. So if it isn't already there, that's what we have to do. And in our case, it's not. So we have an angle that measures 90 degrees is a right angle. So we would say if an angle measures 90 degrees, then it is a right angle. So now it's an if-then form. So remember, converse means you're going to take Q, put it in front, and P, put it in the back. All right, so if an angle is a right angle, then the angle measures 90 degrees. So see how I had to change the wording just a little? If an angle is a right angle, I just did it so to make sense instead of just saying if it is a right angle. It's just weird to say. So I'm just changing it up to give it a little bit more fluidity in the statement. All right, so now we have our biconditional. So what our biconditional does is, remember it has that double arrow thing. So it's P and then the double arrow and then Q. And this was the if and only if. So to write our biconditional, all we have to do is basically write these statements and say if, or I'm sorry, not even if, oh my gosh, losing my mind, my bad. To do the biconditional, we would say an angle that measures 90 degrees. Let's see. Okay, now that wording is not working for me. Dang it. See, this one's a little bit difficult, and you too can do this. Let's see. How is this wording going to work? An angle, here we go, measures 90 degrees if and only if it is a right angle. All right, there we go. So see, I kind of, messed it up a little bit, and that's totally fine. Like you guys will too. You just have to get used to using them and making sure that the wording makes sense. Sometimes they're a little difficult to kind of word and get in, the right order. But the important thing is knowing, what do these statements mean? How do I write them? What are the important things that I need? And so for a biconditional statement, that would be your if and only if portion of your statement.